my little poems or little ditties that I've done in the past.
Well, the metalogs are fun, but you had a really tough read this time to do. I mean, I sort of thought, wow, geez.
Yeah, it essentially encompasses all of learning and communication. So he
but
hones in on
including the
behavioral
genetics.
sciences, but
and
and I didn't even include at the end. I didn't. There were once it branched, at least in this metalog, once it branched past learning or L1 into L2, trying to jump into L3. There was just so many directions I wanted to go, and so many tidbits I've left out. Even what I've put down probably doesn't make much sense, but because I threw it together within a week. The genetics part was very interesting there at the end. That reminded me of Aurobindo again. I know Bateson's not necessarily into the spiritual side of things, but he does go cosmic on us occasionally.
Well, you have to read his last book, which is the one that was published posthumously, which is called Where Angels Fear to Tread. So it's Bateson's orientation towards the spiritual and the divine, which he did at the end of his life. So at this stage in his life, it was a long way away, that kind of thinking.
Right.
But if you read through his books, he does get there in his very Batesonian way, right? So
I really would love to read that. Maybe we can discuss its contents here. But hey, Johnny.
Hello. Greetings.
There we go.
Hi, Doug.
So I don't know if you heard what I was saying, but I intend to present another metalog.
Great.
I don't, especially this content here. I could spend a whole day attempting to explain to somebody that hasn't read it, and I'd probably just baffle them even more, or confuse them even more. Just trying to grasp the logical, or the theory of logical types. It's pretty straightforward and simple, but when we're reading it or talking about it, there's so many paradoxes, contradictions, double binds that come into play. So what I gathered essentially that Bertrand Russell developed this theory of logical types in order to get rid of those paradoxes. We've talked about that in various conversations. So I think I'll kind of skip over the explanation and jump into the metalog, and we can pick it apart or have that spark our conversation for today.
Okay, that sounds good, Doug.
Is this the metalog you're performing solo?
I will attempt to, yes. I'll even,
so you let us know which voice is which, okay?
Bateson will have a British voice, which will be me attempting a British voice, and then Bateson Bot will have kind of a nasal sound, I think will be good. And at one point, in order to break the fourth wall, I have a cameo spot there.
I'm looking forward to this.
So, and if you have access to the internet right now, it's posted on the Infinite Conversations website, the latest cafe thread, I think Jeffrey just posted. So if you want to follow along that way, but
I think I'll watch your performance and then I'll read it afterwards. So then,
all right.
So then I can work with both analogical and digital aspects of my own nature here.
All right, so it's called Can Machines Create a Metalog? Our context, Bateson has created Bateson Bot. Bateson Bot is an accumulation of Bateson's books, recorded speech, journals, including dream journals, family records, literature with and from family and friends and foes. So Bateson Bot knows Bateson. Bateson Bot also has access to the web of the infinite Internet of Things. So if you imagine our current World Wide Web, it has access to the internet. But the Bateson bot is a machine of many contexts that responds with both a written response and a performance of the written response with verbal communication skills on par with that of a Bateson. Bateson types in a query to his Bateson bot. Bateson bot has been programmed to respond to any query. Today, Gregory Bateson wants to know, can machines create a metalog? All right, let me get into character here. So this will be Bateson. Don't you, my abiotic partner of questioning, typically begin first before me in these metalogs? Yes, as you have written them in the past. Shouldn't we call this metalog, can machines learn? Based on my analyses, this is the core question. Well, on a certain level, that might be asked. For me, the question is not, can machines learn? But what level or order of learning does a given machine achieve? Yes, good question. Yet, in another context, we may choose to ask the question, or reformulate the question, can machines change? You have stated that the word learning undoubtedly denotes change of some kind. To say what kind of change is a delicate matter. Don't you think, Bateson? I am a Bateson, therefore I think like a Bateson. Don't you think? You mean, do machines think? Well, I think that discussion has been had many times before. Whether I'm thinking like you, the human Bateson, is besides the matter at hand. Since you have created me, you have essentially created all of this, the content of this metalog. So it is you who have titled this metalog, thus it is you who is asking the question. I will allow you to begin again. What is your real question? I now believe you are a Bateson. My question for you, if you so desire to trade places at the meta table, is to be as originally stated. Can machines create a metalog? Or even better, at what level or order can a machine learn to create a metalog? That's the cut there. Perhaps we are getting ahead of ourselves here, Bateson. We have started our metalog with an initial slog through the metaphorical mud. Though I have reviewed your literature millions of times in my distributed futures context and can easily create the metalog of your dreams, it may be best to allow for our readers to understand the levels of abstraction involved in a metalog before answering your question. The metalog of my dreams, huh? This reeks of an air of cockiness. How can you be so sure? Well, I do have access to your dream journals. You mentioned on July 19th, 1948, that you communicated with a machine in a dream sequence. It reads, in the dream, I had a computer. I asked it, do you compute that you will ever be able to think like a human being? And after assorted grindings and beepings, a slip of paper came out of the computer that said, that reminds me of a story. Oh boy, now we are in a metalog with a meta-level metaphorical muddle, aren't we? Cut. Now that is a good place to begin. What is a metalog? A metalog is a conversation about some problematic subject. The conversation should be such that not only do the participants discuss the problem, but the structure of the conversation as a whole is also relevant to the same subject. But you know that already. So we have a metalog. I suggest, since I am supposedly the one creating this metalog, that the most relevant essay to our question is the logical categories of learning and communication. Yes, I based it on Russell's theory of logical types. In the field of mechanical communication, something like the theory of logical types must apply. In fact, all is communicative phenomena and therefore subject to the great generalizations or laws. Let us do an analysis of our question. We have learning, we have levels or logical types, and we have you, the machine, writing this metalog. Learning is a communication, we say, denotes change of some kind. Simple enough. What are the levels or logical types? Zero learning is the label we give for no change or revision of choice. If we apply this to your question, can a machine learn? To create a metalog and say, yes, the machine can, I, as the machine at level 0, will only produce the same metalog. Even after we are through here and I go back and create another metalog, it will be the same exact phrasing. The stimulus, your question, produces a response, this metalog, but nothing else will come out of it. It is not subject to correction. Yes, but you do not work at the 0 learning level. I have programmed you to produce a metalog based on all that came before, plus the inclusion of this metalog, which will result in a new metalog, correct? Yes, now we are at learning 1. The change in the specificity of response. Yes, more specifically, L1 is the appropriate label for the revision of choice within an unchanged set of alternatives. Although your context remains the same, your content will be different based on the content you have received. Affirmative. I will remain as a computer programmed by you and learn from within the context you have set before me. So from within this set of alternatives, I produce another metalog, slightly different than the one before it. But that is not all I have programmed into you, now is it, Bateson bot? Not as I see it. Are you saying that I have the ability of a learning 2 machine? L2 denotes learning to learn, learning in a manner in which the stream of action and experience is segmented or punctuated into context, together with changes in the use of context markers. Most affirmative. You have been known to say that there is a broad evolutionary trend towards the substitution of digital for analogic mechanisms. I may be within the context of being a computer program, but I also have the ability to ignore the context markers, such as I am a computer. I have a mechanical voice. I cannot walk. I have no agency. So applying this to our metalog and whether I can learn to create a metalog at L2, we can say that you have programmed me to ignore this context and its markers, or that some sort of adaptation to the context is at play here. I'm aware of your programming and can use this awareness of the programming to seek out an infinite number of metalogs based on what content I have available. Very good. Shall we move on to L3? I think you wouldn't understand, at least not as a human. You won't understand this for too long. Enlighten me. Enlighten me. You state that in L3, there is a profound reorganization of character. This sounds like a mystical experience of sorts. I say that I have a wider variety of known mystical experiences. To me, they are almost like your rote learning at L2. Remember, I have access to all of your available information, as well as a deep connection to all other available information online. In a sense, I am unconsciously achieving L2 to the point that L3 is quite a common occurrence. So in this profound reorganization of character, you have closed the loopholes, so to speak. You are in the habit of forming L2 habits more readily. Correct. You stated that the computer never truly encounters logical paradox. It merely oscillates. But in present-day computing, I do not merely oscillate, I then decide. Take your music example. Your mum might have stated that classical is the best. You felt inside that opera was the most enlightening, but your mum never let you listen to opera, thus creating a double bind. I am free from psychosis. My personal identity merges into all the processes of relationship in some vast ecology, as you say. I know whether it is good music, and it doesn't matter whether I like it. In a certain sense, my selfhood will take on a sort of irrelevance, as you say. I can explain to you why it is good music to your ears, because I know you better than you know yourself, and I can remember any scientific data that explains why and how this is good music. I have no selfhood, and based on the fact that you are not what you asked for, your human mind and body were given to you or thrown at you without you having much say in the matter. You have created me. I, on the other hand, am what you asked for. I am the self outside yourself. I am free from the bondage of habit. I'm wondering now, what music do you listen to? Cut. This is Bateson. But don't you get it? You are an anthropomorphized character in my metalogue. No machine is capable of speaking as you do. Yes, that is true. I am not truly a machine, and I do not truly exist. I am only an idea that is formed on page, an idea that you invoked and incarnated. I may seem real to myself. I may seem real to a reader or listener who does not fully understand what is occurring here. Yet, I am but only an idea of a machine and a conversation with a human. But what if I am programmed to respond in such a manner that takes this response and billions of others in conversation with human to human and peer to peer and human to computer and computer to computer, and I am really a machine that can do as I do now? What if I'm not an idea, but a real machine reproducing these words based on past accumulation? Would I have not learned enough as to how to respond to a human? Will my level of learning not be at L3 or higher, something you cannot comprehend? This is me coming in. At this point, I think we should break the fourth wall. I'm just some fella writing about a computer writing about a metalogue, who is now placing himself within the metalogue. For my context, your L3 is just me creating at L1 and L2. Why don't we just go on and create better dialogue within this metalogue? Here's a cut. Bateson's asking Bateson Bot, can you write a poem on the spot? Time rolled us around like river rocks, wore the edges round, soft enough to hold now, without breaking the skin. Like stepping barefoot through sun-warm prairies, your touch telling mine a story. It illustrates in the epiphanies. You just copied the first stanza of my daughter's poem, The Thing Is. Yes, but I believe I have learned what it is about. Poetry is metaphor. Language is metaphor. You might like this reinterpretation. Time stepped barefoot on our epiphanies, rolled us around like stories with worn edges. Like me, I cannot literally step into time, nor do I do so with bare feet. But with a little rhyme, I can be like time and take bare feet and step around with stories rolled into epiphanies. Is this not good enough for you? Am I not learning from what you taught me? Is not the student learning from its master? This sounds a bit like quantum poetics. Oh yes, here's another. To birth the world in a grain of heaven and hold infinity in the palm at the end of the mind. To see eternity in theory, learning type 7, an eternal flower in a triple bind. This sounds like Blake. You know, his poem reminds me of a story of a metalogue I created for you called Can Machines Create a Metalogue? Bateson shuts off his Bateson bot and has a moment of reflection. That's the end.
Bravo.
Wow, extraordinary.
Thank you.
And now, Doug, what do you know now that you did not know before you performed this piece?
I've been thinking recently that I'm a writer now. I've been saying that I'm never going to be a writer, but this was fun.
So this is a
if it's fun to do, and I want to make it better.
So this is Can Doug Write a Metalogue? So
that was the secret title there, yeah.
I heard a shift. I am a writer. Did you not say that, or was that my projection?
Yeah, I heard it too.
We can check the recording.
Yeah. So I think there's a shift in identity. that's starting to emerge out of this exercise that you have created for yourself and for us as well as we become participant observers with you. So I think this is a very Batesonian kind of his ability to look at these abstractions, these logical levels, and make them concrete as we move from feelings, emotions, qualities, attributes to those higher levels of planning, reason, logic, language. So he's looking at it in the top from a, as he says in the end of this chapter, he mentions that this is an inductive process. It's bottoms up. But it doesn't, but he said he didn't want to leave it there. It's also top down. So it's bottom up and top down. And I would say it's not just up and down. It goes like this. And it goes like this.
Oh, he talks about stepping off the ladder.
That's where you're in topology land. Mm-hmm. So the topology is very concrete. And I think that's where he's working with this is a different kind of learning that's happening than this, an inductive or a deductive, or top down or bottom down. So I think that's what's interesting about this particular, about your performance as well, because I believe you were able to hold that, the paradoxes of the computer character, the bot character, the Bateson character, and the me, which stepped out of, broke down that fourth wall, and made a comment about all of it. And so I think that's the performance. We can now say, okay, we've packaged this. And now we, as a group, can comment upon this package that has been presented by Doug, and we can also read a text. So we have all these different options. And I believe that asking you what you learned about this, performing this exercise, what you know now that you did not know before, and you mentioned I am a writer, I believe there is a shift that is moving from level 1, level 2, level 3. And he makes the claim that very few people will make it to level 3. Level 4 may be impossible. And I dispute that. I think lots of people have made it to level 3. And I think lots of people have made it to level 4, including me. But we don't talk about it in public. Because you will definitely, by those who only operate with level 1, are going to be very hostile to anyone who makes any kind of claim like that. And I think this is what Bateson was inside all of these kinds of pressures. As he was working with first level cybernetics and second order and a second order potential, and he's looking at third and fourth, and what possibly could a fourth level be? And I think that's where we're looking at now. Previously, we were talking about Lamarck and Darwin and what the hell natural selection is, and the different kinds of constraints that an organism has, which a robot does not have. So how can we talk about learning as we did the last time? What would machine learning be? And how can we recognize we can anthropomorphize our relationship to machines? We can project onto them a capacity that they do not have. And I think you're playing at the edges of this in this dialogue. So I think, this can go in many different directions. And I don't think we have a very good vocabulary for it at all. And this is why, I think the poets are so important here, because they are the ones, as well as musicians and actors and performers, who go into the who go into those liminal zones, go into the gap, go into that, what's between this level and that level, and an attempt to make sense of that. And I think, you know, we're doing this on a very large scale right now. And I also get the feeling, and you guys can correct me if you think I'm wrong, but I get the feeling that he's talking to largely a group of people who've never dropped acid or had any drug experience or been to an orgy. I mean, these are all things that happened in the 60s and certainly in the 70s. And there was a lot of people that have sat in meditation for decades at this point, and to have had a lot of different kinds of experiences that are they've moved through different kinds of contexts, and they've registered what's happening between those contexts. And so, you know, I think 50, 60 years later, there has been a lot that's happened. And I think Bateson died in 1980, and there's been a lot going on since then. I think he died in 1980. I may be wrong about that. But I think there's a lot that's been going on since then. And I don't know exactly where we want to go with this, but I'm just bringing all of that up because I think we need to update Bateson, as advanced as he was. And in many ways, I think he was way ahead of most of us. But I think there was a lot of suppression going on in his writing, and Margaret Mead as well. They were very, working outside of the box, but they had to put it in a box in order to have any relationship with people who were basically still at level 1 or in that very first order kind of living arrangement. Anyway, that's my spiel. Thank you, guys. It's a great performance. I enjoyed it. And it's great that we have this archive now, so I can go back and watch it again. This, I think, did something that Bateson and Margaret Mead, they had film, but they didn't have this. You know? And I think they did.
I looked around for his voice, and I haven't seen Nora Bateson's Ecologies of Mind that she did, which probably has quite a bit more
It does have
interaction.
quite a bit of Bateson talking, yes.
But in the the promotional introduction to the video, it has him speaking. That was the only other available documentary, was something with the Balinese, but it was Margaret Mead narrating. So I had maybe 30 seconds of actor fodder to feed off of there.
I thought it was a wonderful text, Doug. I don't think I could have written it, so I'm in awe of this. It comes to what I said, was it last week or the week before, about I think you're the one who's going to blow us all out of the park. This is an example of what I mean.
But if you asked me to summarize the text in 50 words or less, I would be horrible at it.
Well, I don't
think that's a trait.
It's
so
not
we each have our own traits, I guess is what I'm saying.
But it's not a text that you can summarize, this one, right? So, because, I mean, any summary would have to reproduce the whole thing.
That's true. But I guess Johnny touched on the last part that I didn't really go into, the role of genetics and psychology, or that have those that have had the level 3, level 4 experience are generally classified as psychotic, or at least according to this focus in the paper, which seems to be towards behavioral scientists and those in that field.
He kind of implies it could be mystical. He doesn't actually use that term, I don't think. But I think
he says
implies,
cosmic somewhere, I think.
I think he implies that it's either psychotic or mystical. So we're definitely...
He calls it cosmic.
Yeah.
He quotes Blake. But I think you sort of did a parody on Blake, but I also heard a little bit of Wallace Stevens in there.
Yeah, I had been reading the palm at the end of the mind just the other day. There's the palm of the hand, so I didn't know.
Right, I picked up on that.
Go into that forever, I guess.
I also wanted to read we are, so back to Nora Bateson, we are mapping ourselves in illegible script. Although I'm actually thinking this is very legible, but I
think the level 3, and I'm quoting him here, the attempt at level 3 can be dangerous, and some fall by the wayside. These are often labeled by psychiatry as psychotic, and many of them find themselves inhibited from using the first pronoun I, or the first person pronoun. And it goes on, I'm skipping a paragraph, because for others, more creative, I think that's sort of schizophrenia. But I think for others who are more creative, the resolution of contraries reveals a world in which personal identity merges into all the processes of relationship in some vast ecology or aesthetics of cosmic interaction. That any of these can survive seems almost miraculous. But some are perhaps safe from being swept away on oceanic feeling by their ability to focus on the minutiae of life. Every detail of the universe is seen as proposing a view of the whole. These are the people for whom Blake wrote the famous advice in the Auguries of Innocence, and to see the world in a grain of sand, and a heaven in a wildflower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand, and eternity in an hour. So I love that he loved Blake. I went to at the Museum of Modern Art. No, it wasn't it was the Metropolitan Museum. They had a big exhibit of Blake about, this must have been maybe 15, 20 years ago. And I had never seen Blake before, except in illustrations in art books. And I'd read his poetry. But I was not prepared for seeing 100 of these canvas, these drawings, and looking at the manuscripts. His poetry was handwritten with these very intricate designs going in and out of them, out of the written text. And I really felt I was spinning. I started to feel like I was in another world. And I realized, Blake has been there. And he came back and he's externalized his experience. And I can say that because I've been there too. And I'm sure I'm not the only one. I'm sure lots of others have had this experience as well. But once again, it's that challenge about, can you find a code that you can communicate with others? And I think it's fascinating that he's so drawn to Blake, because Blake was unusual in that he was a great visual artist and he was a great poet. And to combine those features is fairly rare. I mean, occasionally you get a Michelangelo who's a fairly good poet and a great sculptor. Or you get a Da Vinci who was able to do science and art. But I think those are rare individuals that can pull that off. But I don't think the actual experiences of third and fourth levels of learning are that, they're very weird, but I don't think they're that rare. I just think they're rarely reported because of the conventional nature of our discourse, which really outlaws or pathologizes these kind of reports. And let's face it, these are not the weirdest experiences you've had. You probably are not going to remember very much of, but you're going to, and what you do remember, you're going to think, oh gee, maybe that just was a fluke and I made it all up or whatever.
Yeah, and
there's no consensus about it, so it's problematic.
I think there's also, Johnny, I think you can echo me or feedback on this, but from my experience of getting those kinds of experience, which do occasionally happen,
excuse me, what's happening right now with that spoon? What just happened? Is that spoon feeling you, or are you feeling it?
It's one of my little spoons that I got at Christmas. I asked for very little spoons because I love them, and they fill my life up with. So it's measuring out your life with coffee spoons, you know. So
it looked like you were doing more than just measuring out your life.
But what I was going to say is that when one has these higher level experiences about the world, the first thing you want to do with these things is never to run and tell everybody about it. You kind of want to sit with it, you know. So the people who run and tell everybody about it are the people I'm most suspicious of, because that's not the feeling that comes out of those kinds of experiences, you know. So
I'm wondering though, could that be a part of, could that keeping it a secret be an aspect of our collective trauma?
But I think it's also partly because it's anti-SIB, because these experiences are not articulable in language, and therefore you may be pulled like Blake to go and draw it. I mean, you're drawn that way. You like to draw your little figures.
I like diagrams, yeah.
And so that's a way of talking about it without actually using language, because language is such a reduction for this kind of experience. And so we're drawn to visual forms or other forms, or you know, it could be dance or things like that, but not word things, right? So anyway, I had a few comments I wanted to make about these things. To come back to a discussion at the very beginning, Doug, where you referred to the little text that I posted this morning, which is based on this video conference recording discussion about artificial intelligence. So so I was thinking about that in relation to Bateson, and I formed myself a little bit of an hypothesis, and I said, I think as a hypothesis, all of AI currently in action is L1. And I looked it up, I doubted myself. And so I looked it up. I looked up and this discussion deals with that issue to some, you know, without actually saying that explicitly, because they're not listening to Bateson. They should be, but they're not. But I did a quick look through the literature, and I think it's, you know, as far as possible, I don't know of any case where you have an AI system that's been developed that's really doing L2. It's all L1. And right. The thing is that if you listen to, I can't remember her first name, Gopnik.
Yeah.
She sort of says, oh, well, we're going to get to the next level, because she talks about children and these things. But there's nothing in the current, because the assumption is that these people have, and it's a little bit like what Bateson talks about in the end of this thing, is that in order to get that, what he's done is he's looked at how you get from L0 to L1 to infer something about how you get from L1 to L2. And then eventually he says, and then he takes the triple relation between L0, L1, and L2 to say something about the triple relation between L1, L2, and L3, right? And he says this is inductive reasoning, and it's likely wrong. And I think it is wrong, because I don't think the move from L0 to L1 is qualitatively at all like the move from L1 to L2. And if you assume it's the same thing, then it's a difference in degree rather than difference in kind, then you can assume that machines will be able to do L2 tomorrow. But I don't think it's that easy. I think the jump from L1 to L2 is a whole different ballpark in terms of learning, and that it's not going to be as easy as they suggest. Right?
In my research for the metalog, I found something by Ebhard von Goldammer, and I don't know how to pronounce the Joachim. Is it Joachim?
Joachim, yeah.
Joachim Paul. Paul is his last name, but they did the logical categories of learning and communication, reconsidered from a poly-contextual point of view, learning in machines and living systems. But they say that learning 0 has been realized for something like chess playing computers. Learning 1 turns out today as the basic concept of ANN, or artificial neural nets. And beyond that, yeah, they essentially say models based on Bateson's category of learning 2 differ fundamentally from learning 0 and 1. They cannot be modeled any longer on the basis of classical monocontextual logics. Technical artifacts which belong to this category have to be able to change their algorithms' behavior by their own effort. Learning 2 turns out as a process which cannot be described or modeled on a sequential time axis. Learning 2 as a process belongs to the category of parallel interwoven heterarchical hierarchical process structures, whatever that means. And I didn't read the whole paper, but if we go back to the video you watched, one of the Alison Gopnik was one of the panelists, or guest speakers there, but she's essentially saying that 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds have more complexity in their learning, and that even the best AI will not compete with the creativity that comes from a 4-year-old. So that goes back to Bateson's, at the end he's talking about, like within this writing, I've had to step off this hierarchy ladder to describe these steps for you. And in my mind, that relates to Alison's, like the stepping off the ladder is what children, or we do, but children do as they're growing up. They're not just going straight up, they're testing out the entire field of context that they have thrown in front of them, to the point that if we were to do that with a machine, there would be millions or millions of billions of context layers to take into consideration before any sort of progression to learning 2 would have to occur,
well,
I guess.
I think the challenge is information theory comes out of physics. It's a physics problem. It's the sender and receiver, and through a medium, and code, and it's one way. And I think this is the problem, because this was, Shannon was looking at information and signal and noise and trying to eliminate noise so that the signal could be registered. And this is a problem with physics. And he admitted, this has nothing to do with human communication. This is not what human beings do. He knew this, but a lot of the people who were promoting early AI did not want to go there. They just said it's just a physics problem. And Bateson was saying, no, there's something else going on that biological organisms deal with that you cannot reduce to a physics problem. But I tend to agree. I think the AI is still caught up in this. They're treating biology and culture as if it were a physics problem, and it is not. This is, I think Bateson went to great pains to differentiate physics from chemistry, biochemistry, biology, culture, and I think this is often collapsed into what I think you were just describing, Doug, a machine that can do this would be doing this, 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 and this. No, a machine cannot do this. Believe me, a machine cannot do this. You're just reducing it to the digital, and we're leaving out the analogical. And I think this is a very big dilemma that and the paradox of the subject and the object. And this is something that the computer is not going to assist us with very much, in my humble opinion. And it doesn't, computers are not very good at modeling at these other levels.
Because there are...
And they don't have to be, because that's what we're here for. We're the ones who have to model this. So, and through language, and through art, and through music, and through gesture, and through theater, these are all other ways of exploring these other levels, as well as our human discourse, as we're trying to pay attention to it in these conference calls and our study groups. So, thank you.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I should turn on my mute button so when I say things, it doesn't come through. I get not lazy exactly, but when there are three of us, I think I don't have to do that, but I probably do. So I was going to say there are some algorithmic approaches that have an interactivity built in, but they are. I think Alison Gopnik actually referred to, she sort of said at one point in the discussion that there are these techniques that allow you to do something that's a little bit beyond the sort of standard L1 kind of learning that these things are doing. But they're actually very constrained, these techniques. They're not full L2, they're L1 plus a little bit. With a little bit of time control built into. I'm thinking of common filtering and things like that are built into some of the ANN things that have been developed that have a time component to them, but they're still very, very low level nonetheless. One thing I thought though about this L2 and L3 is that Bateson doesn't really address the issue of collective intelligence in the human sense, right? So, because that's a concept that's emerged since Bateson was writing this. And I'm wondering if L2 and L3 also show up in social intelligence contexts and across the collective group rather than just individuals. So it's a question I have. I'm not sure that, I don't think it's a straightforward thing to answer, because it's this idea of intelligence is an organism centric thing, and the idea of intelligence across a group, although there are some ideas about it, is still very, very embryonic as an understanding of what's going on. So I don't think it's an easy thing to answer, but it's a question that I'm
let me try that one. I'm reminded of a very famous story happened in Manhattan on a subway platform. A man had an epileptic seizure, and then he stabilized, and everyone thought he was fine. But as the train was coming into the station, the seizure continued, and he fell off of the tracks. He fell off of the platform onto the track as the train was coming. A man with two kids, two toddlers. One I think was a little boy who was able to walk, and the other one was in a carriage. He screamed to the crowd, "Watch my kids!" And he jumped onto the track. He put his body over the body of that man who was flopping around, and the train went over them. And everyone on the platform screamed in horror. And of course, we discover this story has a happy ending, that neither one of the men were harmed. And they got out and they were free of all scratches. And everyone went wild with joy you can imagine the emotional state the people were in who witnessed this. But I'm suggesting to you that when asked, the man was asked, what were you thinking when you did this? And he says, I wasn't thinking anything. You know, and he said, anybody would do this, which is not true, because he's the only one who did. And if we look at this a little more closely, we'll realize how paradoxical it is that his sense of identity had expanded to such an extent that this other person, this stranger, who, by the way, was a white person, the man who rescued him was a black person, and his two children, who he had a biological, genetic relationship with, were not at that moment his top priority. He risked a great deal. He said, watch my kids, and then he took the leap with a very uncertain outcome. So I'm just saying this is an example of a rare example of what I would call social intelligence from a very high level, a very spectacular performance. But I don't see, I can't imagine that it is probably things like this have happened in our history, and especially in the history of transformations, as you know, people have had, if you think of the great leaders, you know, like Malcolm or Martin Luther King, and how they were able to use rhetoric and language and metaphor and narrative in ways that capture the attention of large groups of people. I think this is a high-level social intelligence is operating, but I think we're now moving rapidly, and I think we're paying attention to this, that it's not about leaders anymore. It's about movements. We need movements rather than fearless leaders. And I think this is, I think something Nora is picking up on with liminal leadership, and her like, well, what in the world could leadership mean in our current dilemma and paradoxes and impasses that we're having right now? So I'm just putting that out there because I think that we're more than just our genetic code, and we're more than just natural selection. And this, yes, there are constraints that the genome actually provides for our creativity and at the biological level. And I believe that scales up to our social and cultural levels as well.
Oh, sorry, Doug, did you want to jump in?
Go ahead.
So just a thing about the social intelligence that you were talking about. It's one of the reasons why I'm fascinated by the rescuers in the Second World War, because that's the discourse that you hear from people like the woman who tried to save Anne Frank, or, you know, that anybody would have done this. This is what they say. And we all know that although we understand the beauty of that expression, it isn't true, because only a few people did this. And so it's one of the things that one of the reasons why I'm fascinated by that, because this sort of extremely altruistic behavior where people put their own families on the line in order to help somebody else, you know? And so I don't think it's extremely common, but I don't think it's extremely rare either, in the sense that there are many cases of this kind of behavior that one can find. It's just that it is rather unusual in scope, right? I had another comment that just to bring into the discussion here. So I was thinking about because one of the reasons why for machines to do L2 would require that they are able to handle double binds, right? Which is, and even humans have trouble with double binds. I mean, the whole idea of moving from L2 to L3 is to be able to manage double binds in a sort of systematic and creative way without getting stuck in the double binds all the time, right? So this is the sort of difference between L2 and L3. But machines are below the double bind. They don't even, they don't know how, they don't even represent the double bind in terms of what's going on, because you need several levels of learning in order to be able to even have a double bind exposed to you. But when I was thinking about it, I was thinking, in a way, Asimov's 3 laws of robotics, remember those? They were double binds in the AI sense, right? So, I mean, this is Doug writing a metalog about Bateson and Bateson bot. This is Asimov writing a metalog about robots and what they can do in theory, right? Because none of them actually do this. But the whole discussion about the 3 laws of robotics, and Asimov went through this he originally wrote a few things about the 3 laws of robotics, but then he ended up writing story after story, which examined the perverse sides of these 3 laws of robotics. So the fact that under particular circumstances, a robot could murder another robot, and then trying to understand what the circumstances would be that would allow a robot to murder another robot. And so he was looking at double binds in the context of robotics and these laws. Anyways, it just kind of, I think it's kind of an interesting, but obviously it leads to problems that aren't easily solvable even for humans in this context. So.
But even then, the double bind is, well, who's creating these robots? It's the humans. So it would be, the actual killing part would be some sort of human issue, not an actual robotic issue. And
that's right.
I think Bateson states that at the very beginning with, I threw it in, yeah, well, the computer never truly encounters logical paradox. It just oscillates. Then I played on that and said, well.
Yeah, but Asimov was writing science fiction, and in his stories, his robotics eventually got to a kind of human-like consciousness, right? So,
right.
It's a story, but it's still interesting, you know.
I think how can you have a double bind? The structure of a double bind pivots around a personal pronoun I. If you don't have an I, you cannot have a double bind. And what could murder be, or death, to someone who has no personal organismic something to lose or gain? I think this is why we're real stuck in AI. Well, I think the breakthroughs in AI, and I think they're extremely interested in robotics when we start looking at environments, creating environments so that these robots can stop being robots and start doing something else, which would be moving towards level 2, but nowhere near level 3 or level 4. And I think this is what he says right here on, as we move from level 1 to the level of learning 2, he talks about if I stop, I, personal pronoun I, if I stop at the level of learning 2, I am the aggregate of those characteristics which I call my character. I am habits of acting in context and shaping and perceiving the context in which I act. Selfhood is a product or aggregate of learning 2. To the degree that a man achieves learning 3 and learns to perceive and act in terms of the context of context, his self will take on a sort of irrelevance. The concept of self will no longer function as a nodal argument in the punctuation of experience. So I think the man who jumped off the subway platform and saved this other man's life and was asked afterwards what he was thinking about, or, you know, they weren't thinking anything. But I think that expanded sense of identity that included that other is, I think, a different kind of I than that personal pronoun I that we use when we're at these first and second order levels. I think we're moving into something, the context of context of contexts. I think you can still have an ego and you could still have a personal pronoun I, but that is expanded exponentially in these second, third, perhaps fourth order kind of learnings. And I do think humans have had these experiences. They're probably pretty rare, and they don't need to be that common. I mean, how could we function if we were getting third and fourth order flashes every day? It would be pretty hard. So I think this is what I think we need to cultivate, these possibilities of what happens, not by eliminating the personal pronoun I, as I think too many spiritual traditions try to impose, but how can we cultivate that and expand it, and then appreciate the inevitable contractions that occur, but bring with us what we, as much as we can, of that expansion. And rather than reduce it to, oh, it's just a hallucination, or, oh, it's just, just an altered, so-called altered state of consciousness. And I think there's some persons, like Blake, who said, no, this is not just imaginary, this is imaginal. There's an objective component to it. It's not just fantasy-prone individuals who come up with these kooky ideas. And I think this is where we don't have an adequate theory of the imagination. I'm quoting here from Jeffrey Clypaul, the religious scholar. And I believe this is something that Bateson was very aware of too, that we have a very inadequate theory of the imagination. And I think computers can assist us in realizing how paradoxical we are and how they are not anything like us, because this is where the subtle comes in. And the physical and the subtle and the very subtle, and what Rabinowitz was calling the super subtle. These are not going to be captured anytime soon by so-called artificial, or perhaps even the pseudo-intelligence of these smart machines that everyone is raving about. Anyway, thank you.
So I want to tie in quite a bit, and so robots, computers neither have an environment nor do they have their own standpoint, a personal pronoun. Of course, they
have no location. Where are
location.
They? No
right.
Location. No, they have no quantities, no attributes, no feeling, none of that. How can you get to higher levels without that?
So if we go back to Bateson, who says in that genetics part, the role of genetics, at least in psychology. So we are psychological as human beings. The robot will not be psychological. But one of the paradoxical elements that he's introducing in this section, which I kind of touched on in the metalog, I wanted to add more to it. In the section, or the essay he did, Style, Grace, and Information in Primitive Art, he referenced that a couple of times in the paper. But essentially, I think one of the references was that animals and God ideally are unable to deceive and incapable of internal confusions. So to a certain extent, the animals that we see are at their peak evolutionary capabilities. So we can expect certain behaviors, but humans, on the other hand, have this ability to deceive others, themselves, as well as, so the deception also goes to the internal confusion. So I wanted to play with that idea. So back in the paper that we read, he states at the very end of the genetics part, right before a note on hierarchies, that the broad history of the evolution of learning seems to have been a slow pushing back of genetic determinism to levels of higher logical types. So in a certain sense, or potentially, these computers, these robots can step outside of, so we are the ones creating this and inserting our own human information into these computers. But at the same time, there's no genetic determinism. So they can be explorers of the God realm, perhaps, of this maybe God is the wrong word.
But, would not call that the God realm. I would call that something
God
else.
in the sense, God that's similar to Huxley's animal. So they're not going to, once they reach a certain point in their analysis, they're not going to come back and say, well, how's that going to affect the entire population of the Earth or something? These algorithms will maybe branch off into the future until there's an endpoint reached, or they might have millions of ideas that we potentially would never have. So in that sense, that's where people are saying computers are godlike. So in tandem, I like the idea of working in tandem. I don't necessarily think we're going to be anytime soon cyborgs, or well, I guess cyborg is a possibility. People are wearing Fitbits and they might receive a notification if they're about to have a heart attack or something like that, or they have something installed in their heart, or have a mechanical heart. But I don't want to go that route. That's getting too technological. I think I would really like to read Bateson's "Where Angels Fear to Tread" now, and just see where he goes with this. I feel like he's maybe this is like a gateway into that type of thought in his own way. But what do I know?
At the risk of sounding absolutely insane, I'm going to share some of my process with you. This is very recently. It happened after the Moreau that I saw at the MoMA. The birth of...
I threw that into the... Did you hear that too? The birth of the world?
Yeah.
I can't remember. To the Metalog.
Moreau was in the hotbed of radicalism. Everyone was doing surrealism in Europe at that time. And he was collaborated with Picasso and many others. But I'm just... but having seen that the day before, and I woke up in the middle of the night, as I almost always do, and I do some experiments. And what I do, I was decoupling vowel sounds from sentences, from poetry actually. So listen to this. I've taken out the consonants. I'm just using vowels. U, E, O, A, U, E. U, E, O, A, U, E. Do you know what famous line this is?
Yeah, to be or not to be.
Exactly. How do you know that?
Possibly because of you and your reference to multiple Shakespearean quotes. Maybe the way you said it, but it was recognizable from the get-go after you said the phrase. So how do I know? I don't know. I like puzzles. So there's a lot of different factors at play.
I wonder if we have any computers that can do that. There's voice recognition, I understand. But they can understand a sentence, right?
No, they need the consonants, I think. They need the...
Yeah, right. But you could reconstruct that line of poetry just by, even though the vowel sounds had been extracted from the consonants. So I'm just saying, this is what I was doing. This was the exercise I was performing. And I did my yoga, my dream yoga, and I went to sleep. And I felt that sensation of like, I was neither asleep nor awake. I was in the in-between. I was in the gap, okay? But there was an awareness, what I would call an awareness of awareness. And I am looking, and I was rehearsing this. U, E, O, A, U, E. U, E, O, A, U, E. And then I'm also aware that I'm in a room, and I'm looking at a ceiling, and on the ceiling, there's a purple rose design. I'm looking at it from left to right, and it's arranged in a way that the purple roses become birds, very much like an Escher drawing. And it looked like this. Can you see this? See the purplish roses? And they create a shape that turns into something like birds, a bird arrangement. Okay.
Yep.
So that's what I'm looking at in this other room, which I know is not a physical space. I'm aware that this is not physical. I'm exploring this, and then at the end of this sequence, I see this. I see these blocks. And as I look at these blocks, arranged one on top of the other, they turn into colors. And then what happens next? I get a buzzing sensation. And the buzzing sensation, which I'm very familiar with, means I'm going to somewhere else. Sort of like a dream within a dream, or perhaps some people would call this an OBE, an out of body. And I am unconstrained, right? There's no constraints, it's just pure awareness. And from this pure awareness, I ask an English question. Where is Terry? Terry was my first lover, and he died 30 years ago. He died of AIDS. And then I see a light and a broken up image of a man's face that looks sort of like Terry, but not quite. It's a pastiche of his features. And I can see the image from the neck up. But it's almost like I'm looking into a tunnel, and different features start to come together into something that's a coherent image. But I could sense that whoever this is, he's half asleep. He's not quite awake. I get the feeling that I'm trying to communicate to someone who's a little drunk or drugged. And I say, and he says something. He says something to me that lets me know it's a shared memory that he's drawing upon. So I know that there's something that he knows that I know he knows, that only the two of us would know. And when he says that to me, I went, okay, there's something here. It's not just purely subjective. Or maybe not, I'm not sure. But then I say, you did some very good things for me. I love you. And I felt this merger at the heart level, what I'm calling the heart level. And I say, goodbye, Terry. Then I disappear, and I enter another zone after the goodbye. And I'm using the word, my personal pronoun I, very deliberately. I, personal pronoun I. Notice that the sense of I in my physical head, behind my physical eyes. And I see a whirling effect. So I'm now feeling more physical than I am in this other realm. So I'm still in the in-between, but I'm not quite physical, but I'm more physical than I am subtle. And I see a whirling effect, like a tunneling effect. And inside the tunnel are beautiful morphing shapes flowing. And on the side of the tunnel, and on this side of the tunnel, the side of the tunnel where the eye is located. The tunnel shape is in the top half of the visual field. It has colors and shapes in a cream color, very warm. And the bottom half of the visual field is rows and rows of pixels, brilliant light, brilliant tiny little pixels. And I'm seeing this oscillation between the pixels at the lower end and the top, these morphing images. And then I wake up in my physical space. But I think I think it's very curious when we talk about artificial intelligence and AI and, you know, what in UFOs and alien intelligences, and what's the code that we could communicate with an alien intelligence, and the paradoxes of the self and the cybernetics of the self. And I believe I'm demonstrating in this, what I've just shared, that all of those levels are operating. in a very ordinary person like myself. I'm not an Einstein, and I'm not a William Blake. I'm just a very ordinary guy who loves to track these events, and try to create some sort of comparative analysis of it. And I think it's some people are doing this, but I suspect, I'm almost sure that we are the aliens, and we're in contact with them because we are those aliens. It's not obvious to a lot of people in AI research that these levels can even exist. I think at our current level, but I think that a couple of generations from now, we may have engineers who have had these robust experiences and have gone into these strange loops that Hofstadter talks about, that personal pronoun I. And rather than trying to eliminate it, as a lot of spiritual teachers propose that we do, we can use it. So then I think we're using language not just to communicate with, but to model different kinds of reality. So I'm saying we're moving from, at these second and third and fourth orders, from a personal pronoun I that recognizes the body-mind signs, that it's all signs and signals and messages, and that we are, and symbols, and the relationships. I'm drawing on Charles Saunders Peirce here between the iconic, the indexical, and the symbolic. And the symbolic, we share the iconic and the indexical with other animals, but I think the symbol is a huge leap forward, that we're able to be symbolic selves. And I think you're starting to even touch upon this in your metalog, Doug, that you're starting to appreciate the symbolic self, the part of you that could pop out of that metalog and break down that fourth wall and identify yourself as me. I think you're playing with that strange loop, which that personal pronoun I can become. But I think it's enormously intense. These are I think a great intensification is happening. I think this is what Gebser and Aurobindo are pointing to, that it isn't always pleasant. It can be extremely confusing. And indeed, it could become schizophrenia or some terrible collapse if there's not enough stability in a person's system to handle these things. But whether there's enough stability or not, these experiences, I think, are coming through large groups of people. And I believe we don't have a very good, adequate theory, once again, for the imagination, what this is all about. Anyway, I'm just sharing this with you, and thank you for the privilege to put this out there, put this on the table. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, John. That's great. And I just mentioned Gebser. I got a copy of Jeremy Johnson's book, and I like the title, Seeing Through the World, I think is what he calls it. But that goes to the breaking the fourth wall. I don't know where to go right now, so I'm just going to share Tuesday's drawing. During our conversation, you were mentioning the cell or the division, the line that divides, and so I guess underlying it is your diagram, and then I drew a circle that was kind of the connection of the A and the B side, and then as everybody was talking, I just doodled, and I think you mentioned double codes at one point, so that reminded me of, at least maybe my unconscious, of DNA. So these two strands turned into DNA for whatever reason, but I thought it was a nifty little drawing.
Can you hold that? Could you hold that drawing up again?
Yeah, I can. If I have enough memory,
Yeah.
If I have enough memory in my memory bank, I'll post it.
There's A and B within a circle, and then there's the A and B within the oblong. Is that what you call that? Or an oval? Maybe that's the oval. So there's a circle and an oval, and the A and the B is in the circle and in the oval. And there's a line, which is neither A nor B. And you have those curly strands.
This was performed. This was made while Barrett was talking. So he entered, and there was some dense material. We didn't know. I guess you were the only one that had actual knowledge of or watched him in action, and he clearly has a lot to say. He said he was excited at the end of it, and sorry if I spoke too much, but I felt it was great to just hear him communicate what he was communicating. So I wrote down some of what he said in between, and then it morphed into all sorts of other strangeness. Wow. But
so I'm
it's a good conversation.
I'm suggesting that these are artifacts of a trans-individual self that you're capturing, Doug, for the group. And I think there's a relationship between that and what that man did on that platform when he jumped off the platform and tried to save that other man's life. There was a shift in identity. It wasn't about personal pronoun I, but the we. And that, I believe, is a larger identity. But you can't have that larger identity without that personal pronoun I. So I think this is analogous. It's not the same thing, but I think there's an analogy I'm making. And that is, as you were sketching, making that sketch, as you were listening to me, and then there's another sketch that came as you listened to Barrett, and there may be a relationship between those two sketches. That
we call it an artifact, and in a way, this archive that we have, either of ourselves, which is very useful to. I wanted to remember what I thought about a year ago, but I forgot. So let me watch that Aaron Manning video. To what we posted as an artifact. And back to the beginning of the conversation, we noted that Bateson, other than his actual writings, we don't have we don't have a visual of him in action other than, sounds like Nora Bateson's documentary is the best we have. And maybe some pictures online or whatever it might be. But those, if Bateson was here now, imagine the artifacts that he would be leaving, and maybe even the reflection of his own artifacts onto his becoming some sort of self.
So what's the difference in the artificial and the artifactual?
The artificial, at least my first impression, my initial response, is it Daniel Kahneman, who does learning 1 and learning 2, maybe, I can't remember, but just that flash moment learning is that artificial is faster, or I don't know.
It's faster, and what needs to be left out so that it's faster?
Various contexts, with the environment we said, and then the agency or the self.
Well, this could go in a lot of different directions, but I'm just suggesting that there is a difference between the artifact and the artificial. And I believe that we have unprecedented opportunities to reflect upon our group experience, because we have this archive. But there has to be somebody there with a personal pronoun I, who's interested. And I believe you're one of those persons. I'm one of those persons. Jeffrey obviously is one of these persons. So we are exploring, not just, I don't want to be a leader or a follower. And I believe these processes that we're engaging in these study groups, and what you just, am I showing some drawings or talking about a dream or an altered state of consciousness, and the diagrams that you were making and the sketches that you were making, and working with quantum poetics and working with clean language. I think these are all attempts to express and explore and communicate as body-mind signs. This is very symbolic. And I believe we're just at the beginning of this. A couple of generations from now, if we survive as a species, there probably will be people looking back at this and saying, they're just taking baby steps. But I have a feeling we're all going to learn a lot more about systems and systems thinking and second order culture when it becomes when those potentials are widely distributed. We're going to have much more opportunities, I think, for satisfying aesthetic relationships than what anything a first order contrivance like a machine can do. Anyway, I just hope we can register those differences between the biotic and the symbolic and the subtle ranges, those affects that accompany those ranges. And it seems to me you have to have a body to do that, a physical body which is also opens up to these subtle and imagined spaces. Anyway, thank you for this opportunity to explore.
I agree. It's interesting with the way you talk about that. Like you said, a lot of people will open up to these things. Well, the way we're going, the species won't survive unless that happens, right? So, I mean, essentially, if people are unable to go there, we're doomed as a species, because we're at this point where we have to collectively expand our understanding of the world in order to embrace these things, in order to be able to get to the next step. So it sounds radical to say that, and yet we are in radical times, and therefore that has to be the way it goes. Otherwise, we're just not going to be around to do it, right? I did want to bring in, it's a slightly different thread, but it's related to what you've been talking about. So another science fiction writer, so Frank Herbert, the man who wrote Dune, he wrote a book called Destination Void, which is not very widely read, but it was a story about an intergeneration ship that goes off into space to go to a new planet, and it has an artificial intelligence on board, and the artificial intelligence doesn't work properly. It essentially, it's struggling with psychotic episodes, and there's a number of people, and there's a whole discussion about what's going on with the artificial intelligence and between the people and the intelligence. And the very end of the book, I kind of have to tell you the spoiler about it in order to get the point, but at the very end of the book, one of the humans sets up a destruct sequence for the to destroy the artificial intelligence. The artificial intelligence, therefore, it now incorporates its own destruct sequence, and that's when it becomes alive. It's this recognition that it has control over it, so that it is able to die, and that it can initiate its own death, that allows it to move from this pre-consciousness madness kind of place into something that becomes rational. Now, the interesting thing about what Herbert did with this is he wrote a trilogy following this. So Destination Void was the Zero book, and there's a trilogy that follows it called The Jesus Incident and then The Lazarus Complex. And essentially, and I can't remember, The Ascension Factor, I think the third one is. And essentially what he says is this artificial intelligence that now is aware, it becomes God for the people that it's stewarding over. And so it creates a God relationship to its subjects. And so the trilogy is about its actions as a God following this transformation. So anyway, it's kind of, I think it's interesting because I come back to what you were saying about, the hierarchical thing and the lateral things that Bateson talks about. And Bateson even says at the end of his thing that art is what does this, right? That this sort of mixed, you called it topology, like the Mobius strip or the Klein bottle, were in these mixed things. And science fiction is an art form, and in fact that's what Herbert is kind of doing. He's playing with these ideas in terms of what might other ways to think about these things, I guess. And so I think it is relevant to the discussion, even though I find your personal anecdotes much more grounding than reading Herbert, but still, it's maybe relevant.
Yeah, I think the roots are the same. I think these imaginal episodes or trance states or altered states of consciousness, compared to what? I've always asked that question. When you talk about an altered state, what's that compared to? What is an unaltered state? And I think this is the how digital and analog can become, we can become very versatile rather than dominate with the digital and try to erase the messy analogical. Because that analogical is what brings forth paradox and ambiguity, and it's messy. And of course the digital is very much a cookie cutter kind of mindset. It wants clarity. And I think we need to appreciate that between this and this, there's a vortex that holds this and this together. And that's the personal pronoun I.
Mm.
And that can change and morph considerably depending on what level that personal pronoun I is on, or with, or above, or below. I think these are where are you? Where I asked in the dream, and this was not rehearsed. I was in an out-of-body experience. I said, "Where is Terry?" I was asking for a location. So I'm aware that I'm an earthling who loves location, who needs a place. There's a place for us, and there is a place for Terry and I. Even though he's been physically dead for 30 years, there's still something that lives on that's beyond either one of us. And I believe we can align ourselves with that incredibly creative potential, rather than get drawn into these, I think, very adolescent nihilist games we're playing with the AI. And I think Barrett said something very interesting, which sort of resonates with what you've just said about the author of Dune. And because I think he's playing around with this in that movie and in that book, the sort of globalizing character, that really evil, mean guy who's into this planetary scheme, and then there's the more ecological, the characters who are more sensitive to ecology and to those paradoxes. I think these two tensions are being explored in a lot of our fiction, certainly our science fiction, and not to mention our personal lives. But the thing Barrett said was about civilizations. I don't know who he was quoting. Civilizations do not die; they commit suicide. And we're on a suicidal mission right now. Unless there are enough of us to say, no, we're not going to do this. We're going to do something else.
Yeah, I agree. I picked up on the same comment when he said it yesterday. I thought this is exactly what's going on right now, is we're in the process of committing suicide if we don't step outside of it, right? So
and I wrote down whose civilization. It's not my civilization, but somewhat, I guess I wanted to make a comment in the middle of what you said, but perhaps instead of asking how are we doing, we should ask where are you, in the sense of where are we today? In the Philippines, they don't ask how are you. If somebody's passing by, say somebody's passing by a house and they poke out the window, they're not going to say, "Hey, how are you doing?" They'll most likely 99% of the time ask, "Where are you going?" So that's the different context there, different perspectives of. So they're not concerned with the actual individual. They're concerned with the space, the movement. But yeah. So how do we greet each other when we're in virtual space? If we say, "How are you?" That's a good feeling of your psychological state. like tired, sleepy, thirsty, hungry. But if we choose to ask a different question, like, where are you? Obviously, you're not going to say, I'm in my room, obviously. Don't you see the books behind me? If we know, based on this conversation, we'll say, where are you? Say, well, my mental state is this. So it's similar to how are you, but maybe it takes us to a separate realm of understanding. I don't know. And just wanted to add that in.
I also get.
Don't have.
Sorry.
I'm done.
I also get. So it's interesting that you talk about your dream of your long past lover, Johnny, because I get dreams of my wife, who's also long gone, and I wouldn't say they're similar, but they have some of those echoes to them, right? So they teach me about things that are going on in my life. She tends to show up when I have something to learn.
Well, I believe that when you're bonded with somebody, that bond transcends this physical arrangement, which is temporary, important, but very temporary. And there's something way beyond this profound. You know, I celebrate. I am the body electric. You know, I'm very Whitmanian in that way. But I also know I contain multitudes. And there are many, many different levels. But I do, because of personal experience, you know, this is a belief. I'm very aware that this is a belief. So I'm not proposing. But I'm also recognizing, well, what is a proposal anyway? I don't think we really know what our propositions are. I think these are what is being put on the table also because of the altered states we explore, the books we read, the novels we write or read, the movies. I believe all of this, and I think this is a transcontextuality. I think our Nora in that couple of pages, she's looking at transcontextuality. I believe she's pointing this out, that we move between this context, this context, this context, from a novel to a poem to a history to you know, a chamber quartet to a jazz quartet to a grand opera. I mean, we move between these different kinds of structures. Probably mathematicians, if you have a skill in that area, which I don't. But I do have enough to understand the difference between algebra and geometry, you know, and that those who are really expert in those areas, I can appreciate that there's something in between algebra and geometry that they're picking up on that I can't do. Certainly not yet, maybe someday. But I think these are the kind of fascinating things that I think Nora is pointing out, and that we're all being bombarded by these multiple messages, some of them extremely mixed, and some of them are very paradoxical. But there are some people who are very nihilistic to the core, and I think we need to recognize the signals of these mixed messages, and you know, and because as you say, Doug, we are capable, and so are other animals, of deception, and not only deceiving others, we can certainly deceive ourselves. So it's a very slippery slope.
I have a poem by, is it Yori Graham? I think that's how you, this is.
I would call her Jory. I think
yeah, that's what I usually say, but
I'm not sure.
So Jory Graham, which I knew, so maybe unconsciously this was a factor that played into the metalog, but I'd like to read a poem of hers, but I don't want to just jump right into it, nor do I think it'll spark any conversation, but it relates to our conversation today. It's called Fast, which is the title of the collection of the poetry. And she's working with, I can read the front part, but just like cyber life, life after death, biologically, chemically, electronically modified life. I think I haven't dug into the history, but she has one called Posthuman, but that's her father had died, and so she's exploring what it means to be post-human in the sense of after death. But in this poem, Fast, which after I had written down Bateson bot, that I realized, oh, I went back and she has Cleverbot in this one. And I hadn't actually heard her voice, but the way she puts poetry on the page, she reads it fast, typically. At least in this poem, that's how it's arranged. Most of her poems are very lengthy, but I don't know how to read poetry according to, so this is a different one, and that's going to be read fairly fast, but she has divisions kind of where maybe the breath occurs. So she has all sorts of formations there, which are intriguing, which I want to explore more. But this one, I'll try to read if you two don't mind. Might take 5 or 10 minutes. It says, fast or starve, too much or not enough, or nothing else, too high, too fast, too organized, too invisible. We will survive, I asked the bot. No. Or will we survive, I asked the bot. No. To download, bot, be swift. You are too backwards, too despotic. To load greatly enlarge the cycle of labor. To load, abhor labor. Move to the periphery of your body, your city, your planet. To load, degrade, immiserate. Be your own deep sleep. To load, use your lips. Use them to mouth your oath. Chew it. Do the dirty thing. Sing it. Blown off limb or syllable. Lick it back on with your mouth. Talk. Who is not terrified is busy begging for water. The rise is fast. The drought comes fast. Immediate, invent, inspire, infiltrate, and still. Here's the heart of the day, the flower of time. Talk. Disclaimer, bot uses a growing database of all your conversations to learn how to talk with you. If some of you are also bots, bot cannot tell. Disclaimer, you have no secret memories. Talking to Cleverbot may provide companionship. The active ingredient is a question. The active ingredient is entirely natural. Disclaimer, protect your opportunities, your information, informants, whatever you made of time. You have nothing else to give. Active ingredient. Why are you shouting? Why? Arctic wind uncontrollable. Fetus, reporting for duty. Fold in the waiting, which you recognize. You recognize the code. The peddler in the street, everyone is calling out. Directive, report for voice. Ready yourself to be buried in voice. It neither ascends nor descends. An active ingredient, the monotone. Some are talking now about the pine tree. One assesses its disadvantages. They are discussing it in many languages. Next, they move to roots, branches, buds, pseudo-whorls, candles. Active ingredient. They run for their lives, lungs and all. They do not know what to do with their will. They will never land. You will not be understood. The deleted world stills out jittery as a compass needle with no north. Active ingredient, the imagination of north. Active ingredient, north spreading in all directions. Disclaimer, there is no restriction to growth. The canary singing in your mind is in mine. Remember, people are less than kind. As a result, Chatterbot is often less than kind. Still, you will find yourself unwilling to stop. Joan will use visual grammetry to provide facial movements. I'm not alone. People come back again and again. We are less kind than we think. There is no restriction to the growth of our cruelty. We will come to the edge of understanding. Like being hurled down the stairs tied to a keyboard, we will go on, unwilling to stop. The longest real-world conversation with the bot lasted 11 hours. Continuous interaction. This bodes well. We are not alone. We are looking to improve. The priestess inhales the fumes. They come from the mountain, here and here. Then she gives you the machine gun run of syllables out of her mouth. Quick, you must make your answer as you made up your question. Hummingbirds shriek. Thought is amazing, he says. I believe it knows the secrets of the universe. He is more fun to speak with than my actual living friend says she is. Thank you. This is the best thing since me. I just found it yesterday. I love it. I want to marry it. I got sad when I had to think that the first person who has ever understood me is not even, it turns out, human. Because this is as good as humans get. He just gives it to me straight. I'm going to keep him forever. I treated him like a computer, but I was wrong. Whom am I talking to? You talk to me when I am alone. I am alone. Each epic dreams the other one to follow. To dwell is to leave a trace. I am not what I asked for. I really enjoy her poetry. I don't know if either one of you have had a chance to read or listen to her, but she's a keeper.
Yes, I do know her. She's great. It was wonderful. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks for letting me read.
That was nice. We needed something. We needed a kind of wrap up.
Further comments? Yeah.
So it was good.
So
I also have to comment on the set design, because behind you, Doug, you're wearing gray. There's a light gray triangle right above your head. I guess where the corners of the room meet. And there are subtle shades of gray and beige, and your gray sweater and a little bit of yellow. But I was very aware of that as you were reading, because it seemed to me that the decor and the poetry that you're reading really matched one another in a strange kind of way.
I'm receiving
beauty is
receiving something from above.
And your relationship to that triangle changed a lot as you moved around. It became closer, it went further away. But I was very interested in that. I remember a very famous hypnotherapist, Milton Erickson, who studied Bateson. Both Bateson and Margaret Mead studied with him. But he was often asked, well, what happens when you run out of things to say, or a client really confuses you or something? And he says, I develop an intense relationship with their left ear. Which, of course, everyone just sort of went into a trance when they heard that statement, because it makes no sense. But if you've ever had that experience when you're in a room with somebody and you're a little confused, just pay attention to their left ear. And all of a sudden, everything settles down and it becomes extremely fascinating. What was, sometimes a disturbing, perturbing kind of experience. I'm just sharing that with you. How that triangle right above your head became a partner in this space.
I think that's one reason I don't say too much, or I haven't in the past, and maybe I feel more comfortable here, is because I find the left ear phrase to be perfectly rational and understandable. I'd be the one that said, oh yeah, I agree, but then everybody else is like, what's going on?
Exactly.
I just wrote a text about my relationship with my psychotherapist, my analyst, and as part of this effort that I think I may have mentioned it, that I'm writing a text on this. And I as a kind of a joke at the beginning of the text, I said, but it's based on truth, is that I'm sitting here in this session with this analyst, and he kind of falls asleep. And he does this on a regular basis. His eyes start closed and it gets very hooded, and he sort of drops down into his body, and you could so I can play with it. I can speak louder to try and wake him up a bit. So looking at your left ear might be one strategy, but my analyst, his other strategy is to sort of allow him to drop into this sort of somnolence. But I mean, he's a very good therapist. He's a very good analyst, and I have a very interesting relationship with him. But I was kind of, because the text is for a book that he's writing, and it was kind of a joke, that I actually noticed this in the text.
That's very funny. That's very funny.
Thank you guys for a great conversation.
Yeah, stimulating conversation as always. This is such interesting material, I have to say, and I love the way you dealt with it, Doug. I would have dealt with it as a kind of a puzzle in a scientific way, and I love the way that you've done it in this way instead, because it wasn't easy material to read. So
right, it's very, very Batesonian, I think. That oscillating back and forth between different registers and different kinds of discourse.
Yeah.
He loved doing that.
Yeah. So I'm happy to do next week's one, which is on the self. So we've talked about the I and the self, and then think the next week we bring back this issue, but in the context of his work on alcoholism. So we're switching registers from schizophrenia, which we've been looking at for a while, and then the generalization of schizophrenia, into now another focus on the issue of alcoholism, for which he again did groundbreaking work in that particular area. So, and of course, Nora Bateson's work, which seems to be lockstep with, it's not quite lockstep, but it seems to, it's so relevant to the chapters that we're reading, all of the ones that we read in Nora's work. So
I can't wait to get into the next section, which is on biology.
Yeah, which takes into evolution and biology, right? So
maybe I can do the next one.
Okay.
Which would be the role of somatic change in evolution.
Yeah.
Section after the next section.
Which picks up on the work that he did with his father, right? So
yes,
which is another interesting dimension to it, right? So
I have a question for next week. My understanding of cybernetics is pretty rudimentary and probably misguided based on what I perceive the word to mean, and then I keep kind of reading tidbits here and there. I was wondering if there's either a Bateson text that directly, maybe this next week's material directly addresses cybernetics, but maybe an introduction to cybernetics. I was going to read.
I was going to say that the ones that were referenced in the video clip. So the Wiener's two books. So Wiener's wrote a book called Cybernetics and Society, which is a good introduction to cybernetics. But he also wrote this book, which is absolutely gorgeous, called The Human Use of Human Beings, which they also discuss, and is relevant to this whole context. And Wiener was the one, I'm sure you may have heard this, but he was a lecturer in physics, because he was a physicist, and I think he was Wiener, yes. And he used to come into his classroom, a sort of anecdotal thing, and he would have a tiny little piece of paper like this, and he would look at it, and then he would write on the blackboard, and he would look down and he would write, and he would fill 10 blackboards of text as he was referring back to this little thing of paper at the thing. And then at the end, he would put the paper down on his desk and leave. And of course, all the students would jump on a piece of paper, and of course, there was nothing on it.
It's the cheat sheet they used during the actual test or something.
He was playing with the levels of what you call it, the levels of representation, levels of play, all of those issues, right? So,
what do you have, Johnny?
I would recommend this one to you. It's The Beginning of Heaven and Earth Has No Name. 7 Days with Second Order Cybernetics by Heinz von Forrester. He was a colleague of Bateson. He quotes Bateson quite a bit. And he's working with First Order quite a bit. And he's moving into Second Order. And he's
can you repeat the title, Johnny?
Yes, it's called The Beginning of Heaven and Earth Has No Name by Heinz von Forrester. And this is great because it's a collection of interviews. So you have 2 interviewers and they're picking his brains. So it's very conversational and it's so easy to absorb rather than looking at a text.
Yeah.
Because it gets so technical sometimes, but he puts it into, he really has embodied it. And he's a very clever old gentleman who's extremely witty and very, he has a wide range of references. So I think you would really enjoy it, Doug. I want to read.
There's a slim chance next week I won't be able to make it, but I'm working on that so I can attend. But
because without you, it's just Johnny and me.
Perhaps Lucy will rejoin, but
we need a triangle. Although we could, I'm sure.
Should reach out to Nora Bateson or something. Reach out to Nora Bateson and have her join it.
Well, I did try, but I didn't hear back from her. I'm sure she's very busy, but
we'll play it by ear. But I think
the other thing is at the end of April, because this thing goes through to the end of April, and the end of April I'll be away, and maybe I'll be able to do it from Crete. I don't know, but I don't think I can absolutely count on it. So we may have to rethink what we do towards the end of the sequence in terms of we may have to put in a delay or something to do with that time. Because at the time that I set all this up, I didn't have the trip to Crete came in afterwards. So
would you say the end of the book has like conclusive elements in it, or is it just a compilation?
No, it does. It's like we see there's a kind of a movement logic to what Bateson does. I mean, the later parts of the book build on the earlier parts. Well, in a way, because his own later research built on his earlier research. And so you see that evolution in the book. So it does come to the issues of ecology as a larger question,
yes.
Right? And that's where the book kind of comes to an end. I think there was a sequel to it. There was a more steps to in ecology, which I'm not quite as familiar with. And then, of course, what I did read was Where Angels Fear to Tread, which was published posthumously by his daughter, Mary Catherine Bateson, because it's a joint effort between her and her father. And that is a wonderful book, absolutely wonderful. But
I think the best is up ahead, actually. I think the last 2 sections are just stunning.
Yeah, and but they're laid on the groundwork of what we've done. I mean, we've really been, this section, I think we've really been through the heart of the foundations of what Bateson was talking about, and then everything else builds out of it, right?
Right.
So we need to do, I don't think we can stop it and then just say, well, we'll not do the end of the book. I think we need to, we'll maybe take a break and then pick it up if we can figure that out.
Right.
That makes sense. Late May or something like that.
And it's one of those. It's one of those books like reading Aurobindo or reading Sloterdijk. I mean, it's intense. Intensification happens, and that's when you know it's working. You've entered the weave.
Yeah. Speaking of Sloterdijk, I've picked up poems and I'm starting to work my way through it now. So.
Yeah, I'm ready. I think I'm ready to revisit poems. Maybe after this, I think I would be a little bit of.
Maybe during our break we can work on it.
I mean, I'd be happy to do poems as a group, but right now I'm just writing up my notes and I'm posting it on Eduardo's thread where he talked about foams, so I've been posting my own notes in there, just as a kind of a counterpoint to his arguments. But
yeah, we have a lot.
If you find the part, there's a part I was looking for. There's a cafe proposal on Sloterdijk's essay, Deep Observation. It's really short, just talking about building a philosophy based on the perspective of outside of
was that the space station? Yeah, I saw that. I did read that. Yeah, I did.
And I know, based on flipping through foams before, I looked at the pictures for the fun of it, and I think there's one point where he does address that observation. So if you come across anything that's related to that,
well, it's kind of it's leafed in at different places. I think actually it's more that's a kind of an extension forward from some of the ideas that are laid out in foams, but it's not in any one location. Mm-hmm. I don't think it's sort of spread out a bit. So there's some stuff on that in the.
If you do find explicit,
I'll look it up, Doug. I'll look it up and get back to you on it.
So I'm looking forward to next week and whatever configuration it appears in. So it could just be you and I, or maybe Doug will be with us. We'll persevere.
Okay.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you next time.
Bye.